Once you're satisfied with your mix, you'll want to save it as a single file so you can play it for others, or burn it to a CD, or use it as a soundtrack for a video. Whatever the case, you'll want to export a single file of your song or project, and you do so from the File menu. Here, choose Export, Multitrack Mixdown, Entire Session. The other option here is Time Selection, which if I had made a selection within my mix, would allow me to export just that particular selection. And that might be useful if you want to send a guitar solo for the artist to approve or something like that. But in this case, I want to choose to export the entire session. That gives me the Export Multitrack Mixdown window. First field is for the file name. Just type whatever you want in this field. I'm going to call this Breakdown Mode Rough to indicate that this is a rough mix. The file extension will be determined by whatever you have selected in the Format menu here. I'll get to that in just a second. The location field shows where this file is going to be exported to. Click Browse to choose another location. I'm going to save this to my desktop. Okay, so for the format, you can choose from many different audio formats here. If you want to save a high-quality uncompressed version of the file, choose either WAV, which is the default, or AIF. Traditionally, AIFs were for Macs and WAVs were for Windows. But since the Mac can read either one these days, I'm going to stick with WAV. Now, if you want to change a sample type, you can click Change here. But I'm going to leave mine as same as source. I'm not going to bother with any conversions in this case. Under Format Settings, you see the current settings for the format you selected. Now this is going to change based on what you select as the format. For example, maybe I want to email this mix to a friend. A WAV file is most likely going to be too large to email, so maybe I want to switch this to MP3. So now the format settings show that this is an MP3 and has the default bitrate of 192 kilobits per second and a constant bitrate. You can click Change if you want to alter those settings, and what you see here is going to depend on what format you chose. For the MP3, I can choose between a constant or a variable bitrate, and then I can make a setting based on that choice above. I'm going to keep it the way it is. And under Mixdown options, you have some cool choices. By default, I'm creating a single file, a mix of the song in its current state. I can also click Change here and select other sources to export simultaneously. This is a stereo mix, so I'm exporting a stereo version. I could also check mono and 5.1 if I wanted to export a mono mix and a surround mix. I didn't really set up my mix for either of those, so I'm going to keep those unchecked. But what's really cool about this to me is that you can also export individual tracks. Maybe the bass player wants to hear his track isolated on its own. I can scroll down, find bass and check it. Notice that puts a little eye icon down here. And that tells me that exporting multiple sources will append the source name to the end of my file name that I've chosen. We'll see what that means in just a second. I'll click OK. Lastly, I have the option of whether I want to include any markers or other metadata I've created in the session. I don't really need that in this case. I'll just uncheck that. Markers and metadata don't really take up that much space, but I figure why add it if I don't need it. I'm also going to uncheck Open Files after Export. With it checked, my files would open so I could play them right away, but I want to manually show them to you first. All right, so I'm going to click OK. Now, how long this takes depends on how long your song is, how many tracks it has, and how many files you've chosen to export. All right, so the export is done. I'm going to hide Audition for a moment so I can look at my desktop. And I have some files here. Here's Breakdown Mode Rough Stereo, so that's the stereo mix of the full song. I can just preview this in the Mac by pressing the space bar on my keyboard to preview it. That's the whole mix. And I also have the Breakdown Mode Rough Bass. Notice it appended the word bass because that's the name of the track. And again, if I preview that, just jump ahead a little bit, I'm hearing just the bass track. So really, it's very easy to export that final mixdown or individual tracks. But don't confuse this process with what you would do if you want to export the entire session so you can continue to edit it in Audition, maybe on a different computer. While you could export all the individual tracks this way, you would lose your session settings, effects, and so on. In the next movie, I'll show you how to save the session as a backup or for use on another computer running Audition.